uses after he's trying to teach love of enemies. And he says, my Father's sun shines on the good and the bad. His rain falls on the just and the unjust. That is classic non-duality. If I had offered that phrase in my moral theology course and tried to defend it, I would not have been ordained, all right? Unfortunately, Jesus said it first, right? And the present papacy would call this relativism. No, the Father's sun doesn't shine equally on Hindus and Buddhists and Protestants. And we're invested in dualistic thinking. It holds the tribe together. It holds any group together. People seeking power will always prefer dualistic thinking, either or thinking, all or nothing thinking. The other line, we could have the whole evening just on Jesus' non-dual teaching, but I just want to invite you into it. And many of you are going to go back and read Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, and you'll see it's everywhere. But they're usually the lines that we consider the throwaway lines because we didn't know what to do with them. You couldn't make a dogma out of it, you know. You couldn't decide who to exclude from the communion table, you know. You couldn't decide who was worthy and who was unworthy. You couldn't decide who's going to heaven and who isn't going to heaven. Matthew 13. Let the weeds and the wheat both grow together. If you go out and try to pull up the weeds, you will pull up the wheat along with it. My God, that's brilliant. That the angels at the end of time, it's not your problem to decide who are the bad people and who are the good people. So the frontispiece, some of you might have noticed, to the book, was that line from Genesis, you know. The one tree that you are not to eat of is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. My interpretation of that. Well, I mean, it doesn't sound like a very bad tree to eat of, doesn't it? Haven't you all been eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? You probably came tonight to get a few more apples off of that tree. As soon as the mental ego decides God is here and God is not there, right? That you neatly divide reality into the sacred and the profane, the holy and the unholy. True religion is over. It's over. The ego is back in control. It will be able to institutionalize itself. It will create a systemic organization that will hold itself together. Largely, I'm sad to say, based on exclusion. Defining itself by who is not like us, who is not worthy. And we see that was the Jewish temptation. And it was only the prophets who were able to rise above it and to point out to their own Jewish people that God also loved the Gentiles and God also loved the Samaritans. And in that light, of course, you recognize how Jesus indeed was a Jewish prophet. He was a classic Jewish prophet who was pointing that out to a people who were very often, just as most religions are, were at the tribal level. If we get time tomorrow, I'd like to talk about some of the stages of consciousness and why religion often doesn't really want to grow people up. Maybe that's been our fear of contemplation, because it will move people beyond tribal thinking. And we don't want that, it seems, for some strange, sad reason. You take most of the Sermon on the Mount, non-understandable with a dualistic mind. And that's why it hasn't had a mighty effect in Christian preaching. Let's take the clear teaching on nonviolence. Just ignored by Catholicism and Protestantism alike, except for those few good groups, you know, the Amish or the Quakers, who are honest enough to admit it's clearly there. But most of us could not hear it. And we Roman Catholics are very aware of that after 313, when we became the official religion of the Roman Empire, And we had to identify the deep teaching of Jesus with imperial thinking, with how to hold the empire together. Well, most of the Sermon on the Mount didn't work anymore, right? Was unhearable, was impossible, was heresy. We wouldn't admit it. We'd say, praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, don't believe the word, right? Because we couldn't from that structural position. So, where it holds out is in two areas. First, this emergence of what we now call the Desert Fathers and Mothers. They do not yet have the benefits or the curse of what we call systematic theology. Systematic theology is not developed yet, and if you've ever read the Desert Fathers and Mothers, they sound, remember Anthony de Mello, the Indian Jesuit everybody was reading before the Vatican condemned him after he died? He was a classic Desert Father. If you've ever read him, he just tells these silly little stories. He'd laugh hilariously, he'd laugh at himself. But that's what the Desert Fathers and Mothers did. They just tell silly little stories, if I can use that phrase. But after the story, you realize your arrogance, your egocentricity, your superiority, your inability to deal with imperfection or contradiction was utterly displaced. The rug was pulled out from beneath your ego. You see, at that point, they still saw the false self, the ego, as the problem. Much later, we get into largely the shadow as the problem. We'll get back to that tomorrow. But until there was that primary death, which Jesus clearly talks about, unless the grain of wheat die. In fact, the scholars tell me the verb that's used in that passage in all of the Gospels is about as strong as you can get. It could probably be translated, unless you renounce the self. Now, I think true teaching of contemplation teaches you how to renounce the self. For 20 minutes every morning. Just die to the self for 20 minutes. Your compulsive patterns of thinking, your addictive patterns of thinking, because the primary addiction is not alcohol or drugs or sex or even shopping. The primary addiction is to the way we think. And it seems that addiction, every one of us in this room shares equally. We are all addicted to our wiring. And what higher level religion recognizes is we have to do some work to rewire. I don't know how, to reprogram. To put on a different thinking cap, which isn't thinking at all, ironically. Now, the other place where it hung out was that little island to the west of England called Ireland. And the northern part of England called Scotland. Last year I was able to give a retreat at Iona. And there you get so much. You're going to have Philip Newell next year with Celtic spirituality. Well, the Celts held out the longest because they weren't a part of that Roman Empire. You understand? We can't exaggerate enough what that did to Christianity. 313 is when we changed structural position. Roman Catholics have almost never been told that, right? Because it sort of pulls out the rug from a lot of our arrogance. We aligned ourselves with imperial thinking, and you see much of the trappings of the Vatican to this day. And they don't even realize it, I think. Is all built on court, imperial worldviews. They're not bad people. They're not evil people. This is their tradition. They take it seriously, just as we all take our little traditions as if they, fell in a glad bag from heaven. And it's just because if that basic personal egocentricity has not been undercut, how would there be any chance that we can undercut group egocentricity?